Thanks for staying with us right here on Sunrise as we continue this morning. Now, the 2018 State of the Nation address for tomorrow, including the ANC's National Executive Committee scheduled for today, has been postponed. Now, this follows the meeting between President Jacob Zuma and Party President Cyril Ramaphosa. Meanwhile, President Zuma has rubbished the South African Communist Party's claims that he is preparing to fire his deputy, Cyril Ramaphosa. To talk more about these developments, we are now joined in studio by political analyst Khaya Sithole, and from the Union Buildings is our reporter Thulasizwe Simelane. And you at home can be part of our discussion by calling us on 01144711742 or 01144711620. Your comments are also welcome on our Facebook and Twitter pages. All right, so let's start with you, Khaya, this morning in the studio. Yesterday was a very eventful day. So when we left Sunrise at 8:30, you know, there was a lifetime ago. You know, it was a long time. It was a lifetime ago. There was, you know, the State of the Nation address was still ongoing, but of course, Baleka Mbete was going to meet with the presiding officers. Then all hell broke loose.
Yeah. So essentially, the first breaking story yesterday was the fact that the State of the Nation address has been postponed. So there are two possible angles to view this one. The first one is that the opposition parties got their way because they were very clear that if it does carry on, it will be very disruptive. So perhaps the presiding officers were of the opinion that we're just not going to have this for one additional year.
Well, yes, the opposition parties.
Yeah, and this one would have been associated with the new ANC leadership, and I don't think they wanted that image to be associated with them of disruption and people being thrown out of parliament. So that's one angle. The alternative angle is that, of course, the ANC itself had absolutely no idea who would be the president of the country by Thursday.
But
so they simply said, let's not do it.
They threw a conversation in there that says that while they decided to postpone the State of the Nation address, the president was in the process of writing a letter to ask them to postpone it.
Well, I suppose the key issue here is that it is the president that actually initiates the process by asking them to convene a sitting of parliament. So, of course, if they were going to postpone it, he has to be part of that conversation because he's actually the host of the party, as it were. So I think they probably made a phone call to him to say, look, we think of postponing, and because you are officially the one person that is the convener, you need to essentially give us that go-ahead to say you're postponing. So that's why he had to do that letter. So I think it was that type of a dual process, which then led to the postponement of the address.
All right, so let's bring in Thulas on the line, on the screen rather. He's talking to us from the Union Building. Now, Thulas, a lot transpired, and the big question is that we're playing catch-up as a nation, and we're trying to understand exactly what these things mean. We've slept over it. It's a brand new morning. You're at the Union Buildings. What exactly is happening, and what can we read into what transpired yesterday?
Well, there seems to be an interesting power play between the two men that occupied the West Wing here at the Union Buildings, number one and number two, the President of the Republic and his deputy, and vice versa, of course. If you reverse the roles, Cyril Ramaphosa is, in a way, President Jacob Zuma's boss because he heads up the party that deploys President Jacob Zuma to the presidency here. It's absolutely interesting, and I mean, what happened yesterday comes in a long line of events that have happened as a consequence of a meeting or a discussion between the two men since Cyril Ramaphosa became president. Remember the whole thing about the Commission of Inquiry into state capture? I mean, there was a meeting between the two men. Initially, the presidency sort of tried to downplay the significance of that meeting and that it had an impact on President Jacob Zuma eventually appointing this commission that he had stalled on for so long. But I mean, over the last few weeks, we've heard over and over again that actually it was after that meeting that we got movement on that. And we've seen also the issue around the ESCOM board, the role that was played there by Cyril Ramaphosa. I mean, in the communication, he was very clear that the president had a different preference in terms of how this board was to be reconstituted, but they insisted, this being Cyril Ramaphosa and the finance minister, Malusi Gigaba. And in the end, it was Cyril Ramaphosa and Malusi Gigaba's will that prevailed. And so last night, the two men meet again after those meetings, the cabinet committee's meetings. Later on in the day, they meet again, President Jacob Zuma and ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa, and you have the outcome that is so significant it obviates the need for a special National Executive Committee meeting, which was to have taken place today, which by many accounts would have possibly have debated the issue of recalling President Jacob Zuma, a choice that the ANC really didn't want to have to make. So it tells you that there's some kind of an interesting power play between the men. What it yields, I guess, is where we are right now, are waiting to find out what exactly will it yield.
All right. So, Khaya, let's come in there and try and understand this power play following the sequence of how things happened yesterday. I mean, a lot of things were coming out, and then when they followed, you find out that actually a lot of it, some of the stuff seemed like it's fake news. The Russian president coming in, SACP issuing a statement. What's happening with the tripartite alliance in that case as well?
Well, what seems to happen here is that in politics, you have this idea that misinformation occasionally sways public opinion and sways public sentiment in one or another. So when you get some of these random statements, I think even the day before, we had one from the military veterans threatening to have a press conference, and then they come up with a statement to say, no, that is not actually what is going to happen. So in that particular propaganda war, you're going to find a lot of this fake news really being disseminated, because of course people who are trying to achieve a particular political outcome are then trying to manipulate as much of the public opinion as they believe that they can. So I think we should be very cautious in reading anything that comes out of these circles from this point onwards. But the key issue here is that, of course, there is this dual power play that is happening right now, where President Jacob Zuma still feels that as the president of the country, there are powers that are unique to him, and he should be able to exercise that. But then, of course, there is this tension that exists with the ANC president then saying, look, as part of the ANC processes, this is how we think things should be happening. So you're going to see a lot of that back and forth exercise. And even yesterday, when they then said that the two of them had a meeting, which then facilitated the postponement of the special NEC meeting, you get the impression that there's a lot of trade-offs happening between the two of them, where one says this one thing in particular, and another comes back and says, but no, it will make me look bad in my position as either the party president or the state president. So it's really a lot of horse trading that is happening just between the two of them.
All right, let's bring in Tulas and try and understand. Okay, another situation is what is transpiring in the National Assembly with the Speaker obviously issuing out the statement and the cancellation of the SONA. Clearly, so if there's two power plays between the presidents, what is happening with the powers that lie within the National Assembly? What should we understand about that? Tulas?
Well, one of the things I observed, Penny, is the fact that the communication on the postponement of the State of the Nation address came from the presiding officers of Parliament, mainly the Speaker of the National Assembly, Baleka Mbete, basically saying that after a meeting with the various representatives of the political parties and being concerned about the difficulty that they were going to encounter, they've taken a decision that it would be impossible to have a State of the Nation address that would play out in the way that it's supposed to play out. Of course, those are not the exact words that she was using. And then she then says that when they were communicating with President Jacob Zuma, when they were communicating with him, they found out that he was actually in the process of writing them a letter to request that the SONA be postponed. So this talks to order of events. You know, the communication from the presidency says the president requested the postponement. But if you think about the order of events, the postponement was announced and we were told that he was in the process of requesting a postponement. Of course, it makes sense for him to be the one to request a postponement, because of course he, in terms of how these things happen, Penny, is that the president requests to address Parliament in a joint sitting at the beginning of the year. But I mean, in terms of reading it and who has the initiative, it was very interesting to observe that the presidency's statement came after the parliamentary statement and sort of tried to take the initiative and say, actually, we requested this, whereas a few minutes before, we had been told that this came out of an engagement between the presiding officers and the political parties.
All right, let's wrap with you, Tulas. You're out at the Union building this morning. Something must be brewing. What is likely to happen there today?
Well, at the Union buildings, it's all quiet this morning. Of course, business does continue at the seat of the executive, but many of the key players, of course, are down in Cape Town, because, of course, we were supposed to have today a special National Executive Committee meeting of the ANC that we expected was going to have the final say on what happens, who delivers the State of the Nation address tomorrow and what happens in the coming days, weeks and months. Of course, that has now been postponed following that meeting between President Jacob Zuma and ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa. And I was supposed to be on a flight this morning going to Cape Town for the State of the Nation address that was supposed to happen tomorrow, like clockwork, as it has happened at the second Thursday of February for the last 9 years. Well, it's not happening. So much activities in Cape Town, the areas around Denhays and the various, the presidential the presidential residence down there in Cape Town, and the various other locations, Parliament, I suspect will be the sites of activity today.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it at that. We'll take a caller. We've got Hlali on the line from Cape Town. Hi, Hlali. Thanks for holding your comment this morning.
You see, ma'am, if President Ramaphosa does not recall President Zuma, he will not know how to lead South Africa. He will not take seriously decisions about as to how they're gonna make everything possible for South Africans to be in a better situation.
Okay.
President Zuma must go.
All right. Okay. So
remember, he himself, 2016, he said when he was having his own birthday, he said he will go peacefully if he can be recalled. Now, what's the problem right now?
Okay. What is the problem right now? And that's what the feeling is. But there's also a feeling that, you know, Deputy President Ramaphosa in his capacity as the ANC president, you know, it's not like he can just remove and put. There's a whole process that's supposed to happen. Are we being a little bit impatient?
Yeah, you could say people are being a bit impatient. The reality, of course, is that the ANC does not have the power to recall the president of the country. They've got the political ability to persuade him to step down, and clearly has decided not to listen to that sort of advice. So the reality here is that even if we had a special NEC meeting and every single person in the room said the president must go, he can simply ignore them, walk out of the room and still remain the president of the country, because legally there's nothing that forces him to listen to an NEC decision.
Constitutionally and legally, it doesn't line with
it's not a binding decision. So what will then happen is that the matter would have to be elevated to Parliament. And in Parliament, then the situation is a bit different, because the motion of no confidence is a possibility. But the problem with the motion of no confidence is that if it passes, the entire executive, including Cyril Ramaphosa, essentially has to resign. So the key issue here is that you get the impression that the people that are currently members of cabinet are then saying to the president, look, you don't have to drag us down with you. If you resign, we retain our positions. But if you don't resign, we're all getting fired. And I think, in my view, Cyril Ramaphosa should probably be preferring that option, because then he doesn't have to deal with the executive that has been appointed by Jacob Zuma. He can start on a fresh slate.
How do we answer to people who feel that, okay, well, obviously the power lies with our constitution, but it looks, in this case, it looks like the president has got too much power. How does that get balanced out?
Well, it's because right now it's still a political process. It's a party political process rather than a real national or parliamentary process. So when at some point in time the ANC gives up on trying to get rid of Jacob Zuma and then they elevate it to Parliament, then the process will be much faster, because within the parliamentary setup, the constitution is very clear on how things ought to happen. So it's just that right now the ANC is trying to resolve it on its own terms. And if that fails, then Parliament will step in, and then the process will be much faster than it is.
There are pros and cons to both. I mean, they can do it hastily, or they can follow this process. That seems very frustrating for the general, as you can hear from Hlali's call. What are the advantages of the slow process that looks like it's slow to all of us?
There are none, because it really creates this vacuum where we're suddenly thinking, actually, it doesn't look like Ramaphosa knows how to deal with the Jacob Zuma phenomenon. And also, Jacob Zuma is happy just to create this vacuum where people are now saying, but why isn't the president of the ANC coming out and telling us what on earth is going on? So there are no advantages to the ANC to the way that this thing is playing out right now. It's really losing them a lot of political capital, where suddenly people who thought that Cyril Ramaphosa was ushering in a new era of renewal and all of these things are now starting looking at him and saying, but why can't you implement a simple thing like getting rid of President Jacob Zuma?
Why would the SACP issue the statement, the kind of statement that they issued yesterday?
Remember, the SACP is essentially the most aggrieved part of the alliance because of just the way the relationship they've had with President Jacob Zuma. So as far as they're concerned, any hint of innuendo or any hint of rumor about how President Jacob Zuma is still planning on holding on to the powers is something that they are going to come out up against and say, no, it should not happen again. So I think for them, it's really a matter of they have formed other part of the proxy war to say, we are going to push this particular angle and make people aware that President Jacob Zuma is still trying to essentially supersede all existing structures. And of course, unfortunately, what tends to happen here is that when the SACP releases a statement like that, it is the electorate that is reading that particular statement. And then suddenly people start thinking in 2019, it doesn't look like the ANC is in control of its own affairs. Should we be trusting them with our vote? So it has that advantage of them pushing that propaganda war, but I don't know if they look at the long-term implications on how the electorate actually views types of statements like this.
And in terms of like the opposition parties specifically, the EFF also had a long presser just a few days ago. And I mean, we've seen in terms of like the role that they've been playing in the conversation, the messages that they're putting out. What should people be reading into that? What should we understand about what's going on?
I mean, I think the opposition parties are being gifted an early Christmas because for as long as the ANC remains so confused, at least in the public eye, the opposition parties are simply saying to the public, but look at these people, they can't even run party political affairs. How on earth do you give them a mandate to run the country? And I think the real risk here is that the ANC was so lethargic and so slow. The EFF jumped on the bandwagon and requested the motion of no confidence for the 22nd of February. So if that motion has to be debated, there is this particular problem where I do not feel the ANC can afford to vote with an EFF motion.
Because it's not their motion, that they didn't propose it.
And then Julius will come out and say, I'm the one that got rid of Jacob Zuma, so you guys never tabled a motion. You failed at the party political level. I went to the Constitutional Court to get you that protection of a secret ballot, and now here we are. I raised the motion and finally is out. So then the political capital shifts towards the way of the EFF.